I think we are alive. We live, okay, and I will put my presentation, share my screen. Amazing. Okay, let's start. CSS, wait a second, sorry about that. Okay, let's start. CSS is easy. Think about it. Every web developer, when he's starting to learn web development, the CSS part is the most easiest thing for him. And I'm not sure why we're now talking about CSS, because CSS is so easy. Not really. Maybe the basic parts in CSS are easy to understand. But when you start complicated stuff, like to create a CSS architecture, here, if you don't design it correctly, things becoming to be very hard to work with. And I see that there are a lot of web developers, when they are trying to do CSS architecture or where they are not trying to do CSS architecture, the CSS code is becoming to be like a CSS spaghetti code. It can happen in every programming language, but in CSS it can get the worst from all the programming languages. And the CSS code is starting to be like a huge file of selectors, and I like to call it cascading style sheet of file. You just throwing the selector, you don't care about how it organized. And after several months, when you're trying to work with it, it's very hard because every time that you change one thing, something other is breaking. And because of that, we need to think about how we need to create our own CSS architecture. But first, let me represent myself. I'm Elad Shechter, and I'm a CSS HTML architect. It's meaning that my main goal when I'm working is to create huge CSS architecture for huge scale website. And besides this, I love CSS, and I'm doing a lot of stuff on CSS, like writing an article, speaking, and I'm even community leader in Israel that called CSS Master Israel. And now let's talk about how we need to create the CSS architecture. First, we need to think about how we want to arrange all the style part in our own project. And I still think that even in the year of 2021, one of the best way to organize the styles is to use one of the CSS preprocessor. And I'm using the SAS preprocessor in the last 10 years in every one of my projects. And in the internet, there are different types of CSS architecture. And the CSS architecture that I love the most is the CSS Storytelling Architecture, an architecture that is telling a story in the code. And in this category, you already know maybe the atomic design, that creating small partials, that creating more bigger and bigger partials. And this is a story because it's not connected to code. We don't have atom and real molecules and a real organism in our real code, but it helps us to understand the code in a better way. Another CSS storytelling architecture is the ITCSS of Harry Roberts, that's saying that the basic partial, we will use them in all of our projects, and when we are creating more complicated partials, we will use them less and less until we have some explicit parts that we use them maybe only in one place. But I'm not going to teach you now these both methodologies because I'm writing my own CSS methodologies. And I want to show you how I'm creating my own architecture. And yes, I took some ideas from other CSS architecture, but I'm working quite different from all the other CSS architecture. The first thing that you want to organize in the CSS project, because this day we have CSS native variables, we need first to organize this part. Because a lot of web developers really love those CSS native variables, or in the second name, CSS custom properties, and they really use them quite a lot. And this is a small part of an example from the LinkedIn website. When you are doing their inspect element, you have 439 CSS native variables. And this is quite a lot. And it's okay to use so many variables, but you need to think on a way to organize all those CSS native variables. And because of that, my recommendation is to divide them into categories. But not only them, everything in the style project need to be categorized. And what I'm doing, I'm creating separated SAS file for every one of those CSS native variables. One SAS file for all those CSS colors, another SAS file for all those common sizes. And after that, I need to import all of them together. I have in my main style folder another folder that I'm calling according to the project name. And inside I have a main project name CSS variable file with a .scss that the only thing that it does is import all those categories of all those CSS native variables that are sitting in the sibling folder of CSS variables. And after that, this main SCSS file is being compiled to a regular CSS file that we just import into our main project. And you need to remember, in this CSS file, we have only those CSS native variables, nothing else. All the other stuff that we are using these days in our styles, because we are working in SAS, we have two different type of categories that we are using in our own project. The first category is all the parts that doesn't create you any style in your project, because we are using this these days the SAS preprocessor and any CSS preprocessor. And in these categories, you have SAS variables, SAS mixins, and SAS functions that when they are being compiled, they are being vanished from the style sheet. And yes, we are using them for our second categories to create all the style in a more smart way. All in the second category of all the things that is creating us those styles. In the S-style category, we have all the CSS Reset if we need, CSS font, CSS icon, and all the other partial components that you can think of. And now we need to represent it in our main folder of the style. Beside the main project name CSS variable SCSS that you already saw, we have another main file that I'm calling it according to our project name. Project name SCSS. The only thing that is doing import for those two main categories, the no style category and the S style category. The no style main SCSS file is doing import for all of the main categories that we have in the no style part. For example, SAS variables, SAS mixin, and SAS functions, and all those main categories are sitting in a sibling folder with the name of no style. The S style part is doing import for all the other parts that is creating some style, like CSS Reset, fonts, icon, utility class, layout of grid, and all the other partials. But now let's take a look again on the project name SCSS file, and let's see how it's look inside. The only thing that it does, it's doing import for those two main layers of the no style layer and the S style layer. And as you can see here, that in a lot of cases, I'm using the underscore in the beginning of the file name. The underscore is saying that I don't want that this specific file will be compiled to separated CSS file. But when you are doing the import, you don't need to write the underscore in the file name, and instead you can just do the import in this way that I think it's a lot more clear to understand. And now let's take a look what we have in our main layer of no style. The main no style SCSS file, the only thing that it does, it's importing the main categories of all the no style stuff that we have in our own project. All of those layers are sitting in the sibling folder of no style. SAS variable, SAS mixin, and SAS functions. And SAS variable these days we are using a lot less because we have our CSS native variables, but there is some things that sometimes we cannot use with CSS native variables. For example, because we are working with a lot of separated components, and I want to create them in responsiveness, and I want to put the measure rule inside of every one of the components, I want to use global measure rules with SAS variables. And I'm using them, and I'm creating those SAS variables for all those common measure rules. And in this way, if I need to update those measure rules, I can update them from one place. And this is my main mixins file. And as you can see here, everything is being categorized, separated. I'm not just putting all my mixin in one file. I'm putting every one of the mixin to a separated file. This way, when I will look on a separated mixin, it will be a lot more easier for me to understand. For example, this mixin. This is the mixin of break word. And why we need a mixin for break word? Think about an example that in the comment section that we have in our website, some of the users can write anything they want, and maybe they will write the word no with thousands of O. And if you don't have any space in this word, This long word can break your layout. Because of that, we have in CSS some implementation of break word. The problem that those implementations sometimes are different between browser, and in every browser sometimes we have two different implementations that everyone work in a different way. And this mixing help us to create the most similar way of breaking word in all of the browser. This mixing, I didn't create it. I just took it from the CSS tricks that you can see in the link in the bottom. And let's recap everything that we talked until now. The first thing that we talk about is the main project name, CSS variables file, SCSS file, that's doing import for all those categorized CSS native variables file that are sitting in the sibling folder of CSS variables. After that, we talk about the project name SCSS file that's doing import to the no style part, that's doing import for all the main categories of no style, like SAS variables, SAS mixing, and SAS functions. Every one of those categories is doing import for its own stuff that's sitting in the next sibling folder with the same name. And now let's talk about the second main layer of the project name, the has style layer. In the has style layer, we have all the parts that create us some styles in our own project. Let's start first with CSS Reset. First, you need to understand why we need CSS Reset in the first place. If you didn't know, every browser has its own default style. For example, list HTML element. You have the bullets. H1, H2, H3, and all those header elements have different font size, different font weight, and even some margins. But the problem that sometimes the browser implemented in a different way. For example, let's say that the H1 HTML element is by default with font size of 2em. But let's say that Internet Explorer may be implemented in a different way with font size of 1.5em. CSS Reset are here to solve this problem. One of the CSS Reset is the CSS Normalize that help us to create those, to fix all the problem in the browser, the different browser, that it will be consistent. For example, if the H1 is different in Internet Explorer, H1 will be declared according to the main common size of H1. For example, H1 with font size of 2em, in this way it's fixing Internet Explorer. But there is another type of CSS Reset, the CSS Reset of Eric Meyer. Eric Meyer is saying another thing. He's saying that in the most cases, we don't want the default style that we have in our own browser. For example, in most of the cases, when I'm using list HTML element, I don't want to get the bullets because I'm using them for main navigation and a lot of other stuff. And what about all those header elements, H1, H2, H3? In most of the cases, I want to declare my own font size and my own margin, and I don't want the default style from the browser. And because of that, Eric Meyer, creating its own CSS Reset, is just selecting all the HTML elements, remove from them the margin, the padding, the border, the font size, the font weight, everything. But the problem with this type of CSS Reset is when we are debugging the code. Because in a lot of cases, almost all those HTML elements don't have margin and padding. But when you are debugging the code, every HTML element that you will do inspect element, you will see this noise in the debugger of Chrome, for example. And it's a lot of noise that you will see when you are debugging the code, and it's very hard to understand sometimes when you are seeing this huge selector when you are debugging your code. But don't understand me wrong. I agree with the idea that we need to remove the basic styles of the browser. I just don't agree with the way that this specific CSS Reset is doing it. And because of that, my recommendation is to work with CSS Normalize, first to normalize everything, and to create your own CSS Reset. And how my own CSS Reset is look like? My CSS Reset is look from 3 different kinds of CSS Reset. The first one, I'm using the Normalize of Nicholas Gallagher, and I'm just downloading the last version the same way that it is. I'm not changing anything in this specific file. After that, I'm creating my own CSS Reset, and it looks like this. All the HTML element, I'm using box sizing of border box. This way, it's a lot more easier to calculate its sizes. I remove the style of links and button, list element, as you can see here. I remove the margin, padding, and the list style. And for all those H1, H2, H3 elements, I remove the margin, the font size, and the font weight. But the way I'm resetting styles, I'm just targeting the specific element that really need those CSS reset. In this way, when I'm doing inspect element, let's say for the H1 HTML element, it will just show me this specific selector. And in this way, I will understand why I'm seeing it in the debugger tool of Chrome. But as I told you, I have 3 different kinds of CSS reset. The last one is a very special one, because in every project, it will look a little bit different. This is the CSS reset of our specific website that we want to declare the basic typography for this specific website. For example, declaring the font family, the font size, the line height, and maybe you want that this specific website, the text color won't be black and will be dark gray. And I even using here another thing. I'm declaring on the HTML font size of 6.25%. What it's doing that every 1 rem unit will be equal to 1 pixel. And why I'm doing it? Because in this way, I can still think in pixel, but work with rem unit. For example, here on the body. Body with font size of 16 rem unit will be equal to 16 pixel. And this way, it's a lot more easier to work, and still the font size, we can change them according to the root HTML element. And if you want to create something with accessibility that creating the font size are bigger and bigger, you just need to update the font size on the root HTML element. And now, let's talk about something important. I think a lot of web developers thinking that the important rule is very bad. But sometimes, important can be important. Let's talk about important rule. Utility classes. In my own type of CSS architecture, utility classes are a very small thing and minor thing in my project. But sometimes we really need some utility classes. And let's talk about, for example, utility class that hides things. Every utility class is starting with the prefix of u. In this way, when I'm reading it on the HTML, I will understand that this class is doing only 1 operation. And as you can see here, I'm giving the utility class the property of display with the value none and important. And why it's so important to use the important in those cases? Let's see this example. Here you can see that I have this class .bar that is under the .foo, and it has display flex. This class, yes? But sometime I want to hide this class and to use a utility class that hiding thing, this uHide class. And if I'm not using the important, because this is a selector of 2 classes and this is a selector of 1 class, this will win if we won't have here the important. And every time that I'm using utility class, I want them to win, like in this case. And if you don't want it to win, just remove the class, because this class is doing only 1 operation. And my utilities SCSS file is looking something like this, very minor things that I'm using in a very specific cases in my own project. And now let's talk about grids, layout, the main grid of the website. I think a lot of web developers are really afraid to create huge layout of website, because they still remember how we created layout in the past, in the really far past with table, after that with float and inline block. But these days, we have CSS Grid. And to create a layout like this, if you understand the basic of CSS Grid, it's something that will take you 5 minutes. I'm not going to teach you now CSS Grid, but if you still didn't learn CSS Grid, it's really worth to do so. And you can see the example in the bottom that will help you to understand how much it's easy to create layout this day with CSS Grid. And now let's talk about partials, component, all those stuff, all those the things that we are using in every place of our project. In this layer, I'm putting all those partials that are existing in the project. But because we have a lot of them, I'm separating them again into separated categories that are sitting in a sibling folder with the name of partials. And because sometimes there is dependencies, I'm using here some tricks that I created over the years. If there are dependencies, I want them to be in a specific order. Because of that, I'm using number in the beginning of the file name. In this way, if I need to change something, a specific component, and to override an element, it's very easy for me to do so because this layer is loading after the first layer. And it even helped me when I'm looking on the folder side to understand the structure of the file because I'm seeing them in the correct order. And the partial SCSS file, as you can see here in the folder structure, is loading all those main layers, elements, components, sequences, entities, and pages, and every one of them is loading its own partials from the sibling folder with the same name. And now let's talk about all those type of partials that we have in our own project. The first type of partial is the element partials. Why it's called an element partials? Because it's mainly for elements, like H1, H2 element, link, button. And as you can see here, I'm always targeting class name. I'm never targeting HTML element. And why it's so important? Because you have a design, let's say, for 3 different type of titles. And you have main title, section title, and common title. And in this way, if the SEO, the accessibility will tell you to change this H2 to H4 to H1, or maybe even for div, when you will change the HTML element, it won't break you the design and the styles. In this way, you are you're creating that the class name only the the thing that is impacting your design. And why links need some class name? Think about this day you have so many links that doesn't look like link, like in the main navigation. In this way, I can say that every link that need to be look like a link will have the class of common link. And the same way for button. I have a class of common button. And in this way, if you need to create a link that's looking like a button, you can give the link a class of common button. And if you need a button that look like a link, you can give the button a class of common link. And let's see one of those element partials. This is the common button element. The basic style are being written here. But in a lot of component partials, we need to describe some state for this specific partial. In some cases, we have the pseudo classes that we have in CSS, like the disabled pseudo class. But in other cases, we need to create our own state classes. To create a state classes, I'm always using the prefix of is. It's helped me to understand when I'm seeing it on the HTML element. For example, when I'm seeing this button, I see a class with the name of common button and its full line. And when I'm reading it, I understand the connection. It's like a story. Common button is full line. And in this way, I understand the connection between these both classes. And now let's talk about how we import all of them. We have the main elements SCSS file, and we just import all those small partials of element. And if you have a lot of them, create some comments to describe those subcategories of elements. And component partial, I don't need to describe you what is a component, and this is an example of main header component. But as you can see here, inside this specific component, we have maybe other components or maybe other elements like this common button that we just talked about it. And maybe the only thing that the component is doing is maybe just creating the layout for this specific element that are sitting inside. And all those components, again, are being imported from the main component SCSS file. And if you have a lot of them, you can subcategorize them. Here you can see that I subcategorized all the main parts that I'm seeing in all of the pages. And the second category, the inner part, are other partials that I'm not seeing in every one of my pages in my own project. Sequences partial. Because in the last 10 years, I was working at least 8 years in news company, I had a lot of components that were only being used for news component. And because it's becoming to be very messy with all of those type of components, I created another type of components only for news component. Here you can see 3 different kind of news component. And if you don't understand them, let me color them for you. 3 different kind of components for news. And the only thing that I'm doing here, again, just import them from the main sequences SCSS file, all the news component. And now let's talk about uncommon stuff in CSS. A lot of web developers trying to do everything generic, 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 generic. But sometimes it doesn't work for you, this generic stuff. And you are starting to create sometimes 5 or 6 different generic components that are very similar. And I needed a way to describe ungeneric stuff in the CSS part. And what I do, I created another two categories. The first category, I call it entities. And as you can see here in this example, I have a component of common pop-up. This is a very generic component in my website. But in one case, this common pop-up needs to look a little bit different. And because of that, I created the entity layer. The entity layer gives me the possibility to change some of the style of the common pop-up. And I need to describe the reason why I want to change this specific common pop-up. And as you can see, I'm creating here a class of eDatePicker pop-up. And I understand why I need to change this specific style of the common pop-up. And E is the prefix for entities. Because of that, I'm using it. I know that there is a connection between these both classes. And the eDatePicker pop-up will maybe add some style or override some style of the common pop-up. And how I'm so sure that this style will override the style of the common pop-up? Because if you remember the structure of the layer, component is the layer number 2. Entities is the layer number 4. And I don't need to create a stronger class name because this is the same specificity, but it's come after. And in this way, I'm sure that this can override the styles of the common pop-up. And another, and a very important thing for entities, when you are creating an entities, don't create an entity of another entity. Don't create entity of date picker and an entity of date picker number 2, that there is any connection between of them. Because entity have so ungeneric style that if you have two different type of the same entity, it's better even to copy the styles between of them, but don't to create any connection between of them. Because if you will change one entity, it can break your second entity in a very easy way, and you don't want to do it. And think about if you really need a second entity. But you still need to remember that you can use other ways to change some style. You have state classes with the is prefix, and you have utility classes with the u prefix that can change maybe one style in this specific component. And state classes and utilities classes, you can use as many as you want. The last type of an entity is entity for pages. And I'm using it with the prefix of p. This way I understand that this is a class for pages. I have it dynamically on all the type of pages that I have in my website. For example, for the homepage, p homepage. And let's say that those common pop-ups, only in the homepage, you want to give them background color of pink. In this way, it's a lot more easier for me to put them, the style here. And why I'm not doing it in another way, because I maybe can add state classes for all the common pop-up of is pink. But in this way, I don't need to change any class name in the HTML. I can affect all those common pop-up because I know that I need them only in the main homepage. And if I need to remove them, I just need to remove the style, and I don't need to change anything in the HTML. And let's recap everything on the structure that we talked until now. First, we talk about the project name CSS variables, the main file of all those CSS native variables that are being imported from the sibling folder of CSS variables. And this file is being compiled to separated CSS file. After that, we talk about the main project name SCSS file that's doing import for all the layer of the no style with those SAS variables, SAS mixins, and SAS functions. And after that, we talk about the second layer of S style. Every one of those layers doing import for all of its own stuff from the same sibling folder with the same name. And this is how it's looking in the HTML. Remember, this is the first file that's being compiled. This is the first file that's being compiled to CSS, and this is the second file. And we just import both of them in the main add HTML element. And in this way, we have all the style that we need for this specific project. But these days, when we are working with a lot of framework like Angular, React, and Vue, in a lot of cases, we want to put the style of this specific component independent. And I needed a way to describe those specific styles, but with the power that we can get from the global layer. And if you are thinking about it, what is the most important stuff that we need from our project? We need all the power that we are getting with SAS that's sitting on the no style folder. All those SAS mixins SAS variables, and SAS functions. But because we separated the no-style layer, it's very easy to use the no-style layer in every independent component that you are creating in your own project. The only thing that you need to do when we are creating the SAS of the independent component is to import the no-style layer. In this way, you have all the powers of all those SAS variables, SAS mixin, and SAS functions. And you need to remember that this layer doesn't create any style at all, because we have here only SAS mixin, SAS variables, and SAS functions. And in this way, you are getting all the powers that you need to use to create the amazing project with all the power of style that you need for your own specific project. And let's recap all the key takeaways that I want you to take from this talk. First, separated layer of all those CSS native variables. In this way, you can use them everywhere in the project. In the main layer of the other style, you have need to create the no style layer and the S style layer. For special class, use the prefix classes U for utility, is for state classes, E for entity, and P for pages. And every independent component load the main no style SCSS file. In this way, you have all the powers of all the SAS variables, SAS mixin, and SAS functions. And if you want to know more about how to create CSS architecture, I'm writing a lot of articles about CSS architecture and on CSS. You can find all of them in my Medium account, how to create good responsive design, support for LTR, RTL website, and even CSS architecture for multiple websites. And before we finish, my friends, I was Elad Shechter. If you want to see more stuff on CSS that I'm creating, you can find me in those social networks. And my friends, thank you very much for listening. And now let's see the questions. I see now still there isn't any question. I will put this presentation, if anyone wants it, in the chat. Okay, we have a question. Are the no style and the S style just example for the talk or actual recommendation for names? This is a good question. From my perspective, this is the best name that I found until now. You can use other names, but any names that creating the separation is good. Just create the logic separation. Give it any name that you want, but create a layer that all the things there don't create you any style, and the second layer for all the things that is creating you some style. Can you please explain, another question, can you please explain why you chose SAS over less? It would be great to know explanation from your personal experience. These days, I think, and the main reason to use SAS and not less is because SAS is the more common one, and it's meaning that it's more in development than all the others. But less is good. In the beginning, I was starting with less, and I really loved it. But all the new feature came first to SAS, like for loop and all those other stuff. And because of that, I'm preferring to use SAS. Another question, let's see. Encapsulated style in Angular. Okay, there is a question on encapsulated style in Angular. It's when you are creating specific component, I think we talked about it in the last part. Let's say this example. Let's say you are creating this component encapsulated. It's okay to create it encapsulated, and you can still get the power for if you are importing this no style SCSS file. And it's good to create encapsulated style. I don't have anything against it, and I'm using it in some cases. Any more questions? No more questions. Okay, another question. Do you tend to separate out mobile specific style to their own files? No, I don't, because it's very hard to maintain. I'm doing it in this ways in most of the cases. I will show you the example of mobile responsive design. It was in this example. I'm creating a global SAS variables of all my media rules, and in every one of the components, I'm creating the media rule for its own specific component. In this way, it's a lot more easier for me to understand when I'm seeing the code of all the specific components. I have a really good talk about responsive design. If you're looking on YouTube, this is an old talk that I made, responsive design best practices, and it will help you to understand how I'm working with responsive design. Any more questions, CSS questions, anything that you want? We still have 7 minutes. Anything about CSS, if I know, I will answer. Feel free to ask. Ah, oh, I see there another question. How do you name your colors variables? It depends. Sometimes it's according to the name of the color. I have even I have example for that, I think. Let's see in Codepen. It depends the project, but let's see. I have, I think, here one example that it would be maybe a good example. I created this. Let's see here the names. Sometimes it's according to the real names. It's this project, and sometimes I have main color, text colors, and if I want to create something that it's with dark mode, I have a balance and balance white and default. But in this way, if I need to create it, I can change only those variables. If you can see here in the bottom, the only thing that I'm changing according to one class is those CSS variables. And it depends the case. Sometimes it's according to the names, and I have a main color and secondary color. And in this way, if I want to change a theme, it's a lot more easier for me. And sometimes I'm creating dependencies between the colors if you are working with HSL. And I think the best thing is to look in some of my example, but it's always changing. I'm always changing my mind according to specific project, according how I'm getting the project. Very depend. More questions before we finish? And if you want the presentation, I will send it again if someone missed it. No more question. Okay, my friends, I think I will leave, and thank you very much for everyone for listening. If you want to see more stuff, this is the social network that I'm mainly there, Twitter, Medium, Codepen. All the other stuff that I'm doing you can find in my website. And my friends, thank you, and have a good day and other good talks.